There's a stretch of road in central Queensland where the land runs flat in every direction until it simply disappears into the dark, and where, on certain nights, something rises out of that darkness that has never been fully explained. It does not announce itself. There is no sound, no warning, no shape you can properly call a shape, just a light. A single glowing orb hovering somewhere above the horizon, watching, waiting, and sometimes moving toward you with a patience that feels almost deliberate. People who have seen it describe the same feeling before they describe the same light. A tightening in the chest. A strange certainty that whatever is out there knows you are looking at it. This is the Min Min light, and for more than a century it has haunted the Australian Outback in a way that no explanation has managed to fully put to rest. To understand why this light has become one of the most enduring mysteries in Australian history, you have to understand the place where it lives. Queensland is not simply remote. It is a kind of emptiness that presses in on you. Thousands of square kilometers of dry plains, spinifex grass, and cracked earth stretching toward a horizon that never seems to get any closer. The nearest town might be hours away by car. The nearest neighbor might be further than that. Out here, darkness is not the absence of light in a city sense, where a street lamp or a distant window always softens the edges. Out here, darkness is total. It swallows everything except the stars, which burn with a clarity that people from cities often say they have never seen before. And it is into this absolute darkness, in this landscape of nothing, that a light appears where no light should be. The town most closely associated with the phenomenon is Boulia, a small settlement in western Queensland with a population that has hovered around 600 people for generations. Boulia sits along what was once a rough coach route, linking remote cattle stations to larger towns, a road traveled by stockmen, shearers, and the horse-drawn cob and co-coaches that once served as the region's lifeline. Along that route, in the early 1880s, someone built a hotel. It became known simply as the Min Min Hotel, and it would end up giving its name to one of the strangest phenomena in the country's folklore. The Min Min Hotel was not a peaceful place. It served shearers and stockmen coming off long stints on isolated stations, men who arrived thirsty, tired, and often looking for trouble. Stories from the era describe a hotel with a rough reputation, accusations that drinks were doctored, a steady undercurrent of drugs moving through the place, and violence that spilled out often enough that the hotel eventually acquired its own small cemetery. People died there, some from drink, some from disease, some reportedly from the kind of violence that was common on a lawless frontier. The hotel burned down sometime in the early 1890s, and it was shortly afterward, according to the story that has been passed down for well over 100 years, that the first recorded sighting took place. A stockman, the story goes, was riding near the old Min Min graveyard late one evening. It was around 10 o'clock at night, the kind of hour where the plains around Boulia would have been pitch black except for starlight. According to the tale, he saw a strange glow appear in the middle of the cemetery. At first, it was small, but it grew, swelling until it was roughly the size of a watermelon, hovering just above the ground. He watched, frozen, as it seemed to notice him. And then, in the version of the story that has survived, the light began to move toward him. He spurred his horse and rode for Boulia as fast as the animal could carry him, and every time he glanced back over his shoulder, the light was still there, following. Whether that exact account happened precisely as described is impossible to verify at this distance in time. But what matters for the story of the Min Min light is that this was the moment the legend crystallized. A name, a place, and a story that gave shape to something people in the region had apparently already been noticing in various forms for years. The tale spread through the district by word of mouth, the way stories do in isolated communities, told around campfires and shared between station hands moving from one property to the next. And then, in December of 1934, the story found its way into print. A poem describing a horseman's terrifying encounter with a phosphorescent light near the old Min Min site was published widely in newspapers across the country. It told of a writer who saw what the poem called a phosphorescent bird, panicked and fled toward the nearest town as though pursued by something far worse than a horse could outrun. That poem is largely credited with cementing the Min Min light in the national imagination, transforming a local outback tale into a phenomenon that people across Australia would come to recognize by name. But here is where the story becomes more complicated and considerably more interesting than a simple ghost story attached to a burned-down pub. Because long before any European settler built a hotel in that part of Queensland, long before Cobb and co-coaches rattled along that dusty track, Aboriginal Australians in the region already had stories about lights appearing on the plains at night. These accounts predate colonization entirely. Several Aboriginal cultures across the areas where Min Min sightings are most common have their own traditions describing similar lights, often treating them as spiritual in nature, tied to concepts of ancestral spirits, warnings, or the presence of something otherworldly moving through the landscape at night. This detail matters enormously because it means the mystery cannot simply be explained away as a story that grew out of one dramatic event at one particular hotel. Something was apparently being seen on these plains long before there was a hotel to name it after. Interestingly, some indigenous accounts suggest that sightings of these lights appeared to increase after European settlers began moving into the outback in greater numbers. Whether that reflects an actual change in the frequency of the phenomenon, a change in who was reporting it and how widely those reports traveled, or simply a shift in attention as more people spread out across the land, is something nobody has definitively answered. What is clear is that the lights are not confined to a single town or a single old hotel. Reports of similar phenomena stretch across a genuinely enormous geographic range. They have been documented as far south as Brewarina in western New South Wales, and as far north as Boulia itself in northern Queensland. The Channel Country, an area of braided river channels and vast floodplains in western Queensland, has produced the highest concentration of reported sightings. But there is also Yunta, a small town in South Australia, sitting in a low-lying basin known for recording some of the most extreme heat in the country, where locals have described nearly identical lights for generations. And far to the west, in the Pilbara region of Western Australia, the Ngarluma people have their own long tradition of similar sightings, particularly around an area known as Pyramid Station. So what exactly are people describing when they talk about seeing a min-min light? The descriptions, gathered across more than a century of reports from cattle station workers, truck drivers, police officers, pilots, and ordinary travelers passing through, are remarkably consistent in some ways and wildly different in others. Most witnesses describe a glowing orb, often disc-shaped or fuzzy at the edges, hovering just above the horizon or just above the ground. The most common color reported is white, but a significant number of accounts describe the light shifting in color, moving from white to red to green and back again, sometimes cycling through these colors more than once during a single sighting. Some describe the light as dim, almost gentle, something that could be mistaken for a distant lantern if you did not know better. Others describe something far more intense, bright enough to illuminate the ground beneath it and cast sharp, clearly defined shadows on nearby objects, which is a detail that immediately complicates any explanation involving a distant, weak light source. The behavior described is where things get genuinely strange. According to the folklore built up around the phenomenon, and echoed in a striking number of individual eyewitness accounts collected over the decades, the lights sometimes seem to notice the people observing them. They are described as approaching, retreating, and then approaching again, almost as though testing the observer or deciding whether to come closer. Interestingly, some indigenous accounts suggest that sightings of these lights appeared to increase after European settlers began moving into the outback in greater numbers. Whether that reflects an actual change in the frequency of the phenomenon, a change in who was reporting it and how widely those reports traveled, or simply a shift in attention as more people spread out across the land, is something nobody has definitively answered. What is clear is that the lights are not confined to a single town or a single old hotel. Reports of similar phenomena stretch across a genuinely enormous geographic range. They have been documented as far south as Brewarina in western New South Wales, and as far north as Boulia itself in northern Queensland. The Channel Country, an area of braided river channels and vast floodplains in western Queensland, has produced the highest concentration of reported sightings. But there is also Yunta, a small town in South Australia, sitting in a low-lying basin known for recording some of the most extreme heat in the country, where locals have described nearly identical lights for generations. And far to the west, in the Pilbara region of Western Australia, the Ngarluma people have their own long tradition of similar sightings, particularly around an area known as Pyramid Station. So what exactly are people describing when they talk about seeing a min-min light? The descriptions, gathered across more than a century of reports from cattle station workers, truck drivers, police officers, pilots, and ordinary travelers passing through, are remarkably consistent in some ways and wildly different in others. Most witnesses describe a glowing orb, often disc-shaped or fuzzy at the edges, hovering just above the horizon or just above the ground. The most common color reported is white, but a significant number of accounts describe the light shifting in color, moving from white to red to green and back again, sometimes cycling through these colors more than once during a single sighting. Some describe the light as dim, almost gentle, something that could be mistaken for a distant lantern if you did not know better. Others describe something far more intense, bright enough to illuminate the ground beneath it and cast sharp, clearly defined shadows on nearby objects, which is a detail that immediately complicates any explanation involving a distant, weak light source. The behavior described is where things get genuinely strange. According to the folklore built up around the phenomenon, and echoed in a striking number of individual eyewitness accounts collected over the decades, the lights sometimes seem to notice the people observing them. They are described as approaching, retreating, and then approaching again, almost as though testing the observer or deciding whether to come closer. Some witnesses describe firing at the lights, whether out of fear or bravado, and the lights vanishing instantly, only to reappear minutes or hours later somewhere else nearby, as if entirely unbothered by the attempt to destroy or drive them off. Perhaps the most unsettling detail, repeated across many decades and many different witnesses who never knew each other, is the claim that if you chase a Min Min light and actually catch up to it, you will never make it back to tell anyone what happened. It is the kind of warning baked so deeply into the local folklore that it functions almost as a piece of practical advice passed down through generations of outback travelers, right alongside warnings about snakes, dehydration, and getting your vehicle bogged in a dry creek bed. Even more unnerving are the accounts describing the lights keeping pace with moving vehicles. This is not a detail from the 1800s, when the fastest thing on the road was a horse. These are reports from the 20th century, from people driving trucks and cars along outback highways at night, describing a light that appeared alongside them and matched their speed, sometimes for what felt like miles before, eventually falling behind or simply winking out. For anyone driving these roads, where a single headlight glimpsed on the horizon might represent the only other human being for 100 kilometers in any direction, encountering a light that behaves like this, that seems to track you rather than simply exist independently in the landscape, is the kind of experience that stays with a person for the rest of their life. Naturally, a phenomenon this persistent and this widely reported has attracted the attention of scientists, and the most serious scientific investigation into the Min Min light came from a University of Queensland researcher, a professor of neuroscience named Jack Pettigrew, who spent years studying the conditions under which the lights are typically reported. His conclusion, which remains the leading scientific explanation to this day, centers on a genuinely real and all-documented optical phenomenon called a fata morgana. A fata morgana is a specific and unusually complex form of mirage that occurs when there is a sharp temperature difference between layers of air close to the ground. Under the right conditions, this temperature inversion can bend light traveling near the surface of the Earth so dramatically that objects, or light sources, located far beyond the normal horizon become visible to an observer who has no way of knowing the true source is anywhere near that far away. The light appears to hover in the air in front of them, often distorted, stretched, or altered in ways that make it look nothing like whatever produced it in the first place. Pettigrew's argument is that the flat, open terrain of the Channel Country creates almost ideal conditions for this kind of temperature inversion to form, particularly on cold, still, clear nights, which happen to be exactly the conditions under which most Min Min sightings are reported. He pointed out that the isolation of the outback actually amplifies the eerie effect of the mirage, because an observer, standing alone on an empty plain, knows with absolute certainty that there is no possible light source anywhere near them, and yet there the light is, apparently right there in front of them, defying their own understanding of the landscape they are standing in. He also offered an elegant explanation for how the character of the sightings seems to have changed over time. The earliest reports, and the oldest Aboriginal, stories describe lights that remain essentially stationary, which fits neatly with the idea of a distant campfire being refracted over the horizon by a temperature inversion. Later reports, particularly from the 20th century onward, increasingly describe lights that move, sometimes rapidly, which fits with the idea of car headlights, moving along distant roads invisible to the observer, being bent by the same atmospheric conditions and appearing to glide or dance in the darkness. This explanation is elegant, and it is grounded in real measurable physics. Fata Morgana mirages are not folklore. They have been documented and photographed all over the world, most famously in polar regions and over calm ocean water, where observers have reported seeing distant coastlines, cliffs, and even entire cities apparently floating in the air, inverted and distorted, sometimes for more than 1,000 kilometers away. If that kind of atmospheric bending can lift an entire coastline into visibility from 1,000 kilometers off, it is not a stretch to imagine it doing something similar with a single-point source of light on the flat plains of outback Queensland. And yet, for all its scientific credibility, the mirage explanation has never fully satisfied everyone who has spent serious time investigating this phenomenon, and the objections raised against it are worth taking seriously rather than dismissing outright. One of the most persistent criticisms comes from researchers and longtime outback residents who point out that classic Fata Morgana mirages tend to produce large, distorted, often unstable images of entire landscapes, mountain ranges, ships, coastlines, cities, not small, discrete, self-contained orbs of light. If the Min Min light really were nothing more than a distant headlight bent over the horizon by a temperature inversion, you might expect to occasionally see other distorted road features alongside it, ghostly impressions of road trains or reflections of entire vehicles, and yet nobody reports seeing anything like that. What people consistently report is a single, clean, compact light, behaving almost like an object in its own right, rather than a smeared reflection of something else entirely. There's also the problem of motion. Outback roads, especially decades ago before modern grading and sealing, were notoriously rough and corrugated, jolting anything traveling along them violently up and down with every passing second. If the Min Min light really were the mirage of a car's headlights bouncing along one of these roads, logic suggests the resulting mirage should jitter and jump in sympathy with the source, appearing and disappearing, flickering wildly as the real headlights bounced over every rut and washboard ridge in the dirt. But that is not what witnesses describe. Over and over again, across generations of independent accounts, people describe the light gliding smoothly, floating serenely across the landscape, with none of the jerkiness you would expect from a mirage of a vehicle being thrown around on a rough outback track. That single detail, repeated so consistently by people who never spoke to one another, has kept the mirage explanation from ever being treated as a fully closed case. Then there's the deeper historical problem, the one that Pettigrew's theory addresses only partially. Aboriginal stories describing similar lights predate the existence of cars, headlights, and even in many cases, the presence of European settlers with campfires burning along coach routes. If the lights being described in these older traditions long precede any obvious artificial light source that could have been refracted by a mirage, then something else has to be generating the original point of light in the first place. A temperature inversion can bend and distort an existing light source into something strange and unfamiliar looking, but it cannot create light out of nothing. There has to be something out there to bend. What that original something might have been, in a landscape largely without artificial lighting for the vast majority of its human history, remains an open question that the mirage theory alone does not fully resolve. This gap has left room for a range of alternative explanations, some more grounded than others. A handful of researchers have floated the idea that the lights might be a rare and poorly understood form of ball lightning, a genuine but extremely uncommon atmospheric electrical phenomenon that produces short-lived glowing spheres of light, sometimes reported during thunderstorms, though ball lightning remains itself something of a scientific mystery with no fully agreed-upon mechanism. Others have pointed to the possibility of atmospheric plasma generated by ionized dust particles kicked up in the extremely dry, static-prone conditions of the outback, or to piezoelectric effects, a phenomenon in which certain crystals, including the quartz found abundantly in outback sand and rock formations, can generate small electrical charges under mechanical stress, potentially producing faint glows under very specific geological conditions. There have even been suggestions connecting the lights to seismic or tectonic stress in the Earth's crust, an idea sometimes referred to more broadly as Earth lights, a controversial but occasionally studied phenomenon in certain geologically active regions around the world. None of these theories currently have strong, direct evidence behind them specific to the Min Min case, and most mainstream scientists remain skeptical. But they persist precisely because the mirage theory leaves enough unanswered questions to keep the door open. Recent years have brought new attempts to finally settle the matter using modern technology. Researchers and enthusiasts alike have deployed drones and thermal imaging equipment out along the roads and stations where sightings have historically clustered, hoping to capture a Min Min light on camera under controlled, documented conditions, with instruments capable of measuring heat, motion, and light spectrum simultaneously. So far, none of these efforts has produced a conclusive, undisputed capture of the phenomenon in a way that definitively settles the debate one way or the other. What has emerged instead is something closer to a hybrid understanding, a growing acceptance among people who study the case seriously that the majority of Min Min sightings probably are explained by mirages and misidentified distant light sources, campfires, station lights, headlights, even stars sitting unusually low on the horizon, refracted and distorted by the very real and very well understood physics of temperature inversion, but a smaller, harder to dismiss subset of reports, the ones describing pursuit behavior, the ones describing lights that split into two or merge into one, the ones describing smooth, deliberate-seeming motion that tracks a moving vehicle, continue to resist a clean explanation, keeping alternative theories alive, even among people who are otherwise fairly skeptical by nature. There is also a curious detail buried in more recent informal observation that deserves mention, even though it has not been rigorously studied. Several longtime residents of the Outback, people who have spent decades living and working in the exact regions where Min Min sightings have historically clustered, have suggested that the frequency of sightings appears to be declining. Where earlier generations of station workers and travelers seem to encounter the lights with some regularity, sightings collected in more recent decades have grown noticeably rarer, with a rough estimate suggesting that while roughly 1 in 4 long-term outback residents in these areas report having seen the lights at some point in their lives, the overwhelming majority of those sightings took place before 1990. Nobody has offered a fully satisfying explanation for why this might be. It could reflect genuine environmental change, alterations in land use, lighting, or vehicle traffic across the outback that have subtly shifted whatever conditions used to produce the lights. What makes the Min Min light such an enduring piece of Australian folklore, beyond the raw strangeness of the phenomenon itself, is the way it captures something essential about the outback as a place. This is a landscape defined by its emptiness, by the sheer scale of the nothing that surrounds anyone who ventures into it. Getting stranded out there without water, without fuel, without a working vehicle, or a way to call for help can be every bit as dangerous as getting lost at sea, and in some ways more so, because at least the ocean will eventually deliver you somewhere. The outback simply waits. It is precisely this kind of unforgiving vastness that has given rise to what is sometimes called the Australian Gothic tradition in storytelling, a genre defined by isolation, dread, and landscapes that feel almost sentient in their hostility toward the people who dare cross them. The Min Min light fits perfectly into that tradition. It is described again and again across a century of accounts as something that is not quite malevolent, but also never entirely benign, unknowable, patient, and just aware enough of the people who encounter it to be deeply unsettling. It occupies a strange middle ground between a ghost story and a natural phenomenon, one foot in each world, which may be exactly why it has proven so difficult to either fully explain or fully dismiss. Today, Boulia has leaned fully into its place at the center of this mystery. The town, still home to only a few hundred permanent residents, has become something of a pilgrimage site for people fascinated by the unexplained, complete with a dedicated interpretive center built around the legend, and a road sign erected by the local Shire Council marking its association with the phenomenon for the benefit of travelers passing through. Visitors come specifically hoping to see the light for themselves, driving out along the Outback Way after dark, pulling over on the empty roadside and simply watching the horizon in the hope that something will appear. Locals will tell you that winter offers the best chance, when clear, cold nights create exactly the kind of temperature inversions that produce the strongest mirages, assuming that is indeed what people are seeing. They will also tell you, usually with a knowing look, to bring plenty of water, a full tank of fuel, and a healthy respect for just how remote and unforgiving these roads really are, regardless of whether you end up seeing anything unusual at all. More than 130 years after that first stockman supposedly rode into Boulia in a cold sweat, insisting that a glowing light had chased him away from a graveyard in the dark, the Min Min light remains exactly what it has always been. A phenomenon reported by ordinary, credible witnesses, including police officers, pilots, station workers, and long-haul truck drivers, none of whom have any obvious reason to invent such a story, and none of whom seem to describe quite the same thing twice. A phenomenon with a serious, physically grounded scientific explanation in the form of the Fata Morgana mirage, an explanation that accounts for a great deal of what has been reported, but not, by most honest accounts, for absolutely everything, and a phenomenon rooted so deeply in the oldest human traditions of the Australian continent that it existed long before anyone thought to give it a name, long before a hotel burned down along a dusty coach road, and long before science had the tools to even attempt an explanation. Perhaps that is the real reason the Min Min light has endured for so long, resisting every attempt to file it away neatly under either science or superstition. It sits in that narrow, uncomfortable space between the two, a place where a genuine atmospheric phenomenon and a genuine sense of the uncanny seem to overlap almost perfectly. Out on those empty plains where the silence is total and the horizon never quite seems close enough to trust, it is entirely possible to believe both explanations at once. That what people are seeing really is nothing more than a distant light bent strangely by a layer of cold desert air, and that there is still, somewhere out there in the dark, something in the Australian outback that has never fully allowed itself to be explained. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that this mystery has survived every wave of technology that has come along specifically to kill it. It survived the arrival of the motor car, which was supposed to explain away every mysterious light as a simple case of misidentified headlights. It survived the spread of the telephone and later the radio, which connected the outback to the rest of the country and made it far harder for a strange local story to grow unchecked. It survived the era of television specials in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s when camera crews traveled out to Boulia hoping to capture definitive footage and came back instead with grainy, inconclusive tape that satisfied no one. And it has now survived the era of drones, thermal cameras, and satellite mapping, tools capable of monitoring vast stretches of empty landscape with a precision no 1800s stockman could have imagined. And still, no single piece of footage or data has managed to close the case for good. That persistence is, in its own way, the most remarkable part of the entire story. Most local legends fade once the technology exists to disprove them. Strange lights on old highways tend to get explained away fairly quickly once someone finally drives out with the right equipment. But the Min Min light has not gone quietly into that category. It keeps showing up in one form or another in the accounts of people who have no reason to lie and often no interest at all in the wider folklore surrounding it. People who simply happened to be driving home late one night, or checking fences on a remote station, or flying low over the plains, and who saw something they still cannot quite explain years later. So the light remains out there, somewhere between Boulia and Middleton, somewhere along the old coach road, somewhere in the vast dark spaces of the Channel Country, waiting for the next cold, clear night to appear again. Whether it is a mirage, a rare atmospheric event, or something that science has simply not yet found the right instrument to measure, one thing has remained constant since that very first reported sighting near a burned-down hotel in the 1890s. Anyone who spends enough time out on those empty roads after dark, watching the horizon, the way generations of outback travelers have watched it before them, still stands a chance of seeing a light where no light should be, and a feeling, if only for a moment, that the vast and silent Australian outback is looking back.